Well, welcome everyone coming in. We'll get started in just a minute. We're so glad you're here today. I'm sure we'll have a few more attendees joining us, but we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending our 1619 Education Conference. We're really excited to celebrate the work of our network teams with you, and we welcome you to this keynote presentation on 1619 and citizenship. I'm Donnelly Jamna, or DJ. I'm the K-12 Partnerships Manager at the Pulitzer Center, and I'll be moderating our panel today. After a brief introduction to our virtual space and our agenda for today, the Pulitzer Center as an organization, I'll turn it over to Professor Martha Jones, who will be presenting to us about her essay in the 1618 book. As a quick reminder, the registration link that you use to join this panel will be the same link that you use throughout the entire conference. But this webinar will close after this panel. So you'll rejoin, find the same link in your email. Thank you so much. I see some hellos and responses coming in the chat already. That chat is visible to Professor Jones and myself. And so there's also a Q&A function that will be available. We're going to do open Q&A at the end of the session. As those questions come up, you'll be able to share using that Zoom function. I'm going to do can we go to the next slide? The Pulitzer Center, for those who are new to our programming, raises awareness of underreported global issues through direct support for quality journalism across all media platforms and a unique program of education and outreach. We are proud to be an education partner for the 1619 Project. Our 1619 Education Network consists of teams of educators from across the country who collaborate together with Pulitzer Center staff, journalists, and historians like Martha S. Jones to create, teach, and share curricular resources utilizing the 1619 Project. This conference is a culminating celebration of their work and effort from this year. We are thrilled to have 1619 contributors like Professor Jones here with us for this event. Professor Martha S. Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, and a professor at the SNF Agora Institute at the Johns Hopkins University. She is a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of American democracy. Professor Jones is the author of Vanguard: How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, published in 2020. Selected as one of Time's 100 must-read books for 2020. Her 2018 book, Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America, was winner of the Organization of American Historians Liberty Legacy Award, Best Book in Civil Rights History. The American Historical Association Littleton Griswold Prize for the Best Book in American Legal History, the American Society for Legal History John Philip Reed Book Award for Best Book in Anglo-American Legal History, and the Baltimore City Historical Society Scholars Honor for 2020. Professor Jones is also author of All Bound Together: The Women Question in African-American Public Culture, 1830 to 1900, and a co-editor of Toward an Intellectual History of Black Women, together with many articles and essays. Professor Jones is a public historian writing for broader audiences at the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, USA Today, Public Books, Talking Points Memo, Politico, The Chronicle of Higher Education, and Time. She is an exhibition curator for Reframing the Color Line and Proclaiming Emancipation at the William L. Clements Library, and an expert consultant for museum, film, and video productions with the Smithsonian's Natural Portrait Gallery, the Charles Wright Museum of African American History, PBS American Experience, the Southern Poverty Law Center, Netflix, and art. Professor Jones holds a PhD in history from Columbia University and a JD from the CUNY School of Law, which bestowed upon her the degree of Doctor of Laws honoris causa in 2019. Prior to her academic career, she was a public interest litigator in New York City, recognized for her work, a Charles H. Revson Fellow on the future of the city of New York at Columbia University. Professor Jones is an immediate past co-president of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, and today serves on the boards of the Society of American Historians, the National Women's History Museum, the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, the Johns Hopkins University Press, the Journal of African American History and Slavery and Abolition. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Professor Jones.
Thank you so much, DJ. It's really an honor to be here with you, with this really remarkable audience. I'm seeing the numbers, and I'm just thrilled at the opportunity to be part of such a far-reaching conversation about the 1619 Project and my part in it. So thanks to you and everyone behind the scenes who's brought us together at the Pulitzer Center. And of course, I want to thank, very importantly, Nicole Hannah-Jones and the team behind the 1619 Project. Their efforts will never be fully appreciated, I don't think, but we're all here because of them. I wanted to start by situating myself in this project by saying that maybe like many of you, initially I was a reader. I woke up on a summer morning in August, and on my Twitter feed, the buzz was running, and I realized that I needed to get up and get out and find my copy of the New York Times before they all disappeared, because something remarkable had happened that day, and the 1619 Project was launched. Immediately, I understood how the work of the project, the ambition of the project, the vision for the project was consistent with, I think in many ways inspired by, and an important new iteration of a question that in my field of Black history or African American history, it was a sort of question that we had been asking for a very long time. And the question goes something like this: what happens when you place Black Americans, their descendants, their history at the center of our understanding of who we are as a nation? How does that change? How does that transform not only how we think about and understand the past, but how might that also change how we think about our present and our future? So in many ways, the 1619 Project was crystallizing, encapsulating, and taking to a much broader readership the kinds of questions that we have long asked as historians of the African American past. And yet there was a new kind of edge to that question. What do I mean? I think that the project has challenged us to engage in a powerful thought experiment, a profound one, in fact, that asks, what if Black history is American history? And by that I mean, not Black history as also American history, or American history too, but what if Black history is American history? What if this is the central thread, the defining problematic of US history? We see, of course, in the reception of the project and the controversies that have greeted it, what a provocative proposition, what a provocative sort of inquiry that is. So when it came time for the project to then take on book form and to expand, I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to talk with the editors and to pitch them. Now, I have to say, pitching is not a thing that historians are much accustomed to doing, which is to say, our work isn't produced out of the dynamics always that are so important to how journalism is organized and becomes manifest. But there I was pitching to the editors of this project my idea about how I might contribute to the expanded version of the project. I had written a book, as DJ mentioned, that was published in 2018 called Birthright Citizens, that I hoped was generated out of the same sorts of questions that animated the 1619 project. In my version, what happens when you put Black Americans at the center of the story of citizenship in the United States? What happens when you use the archives derived from the Black past to tell the story of American citizenship? And one of the things I had learned in writing that book, and I'll say more about it as we talk, one of the things I learned in that book is that indeed there was a radically new story to be told when we put Black Americans, and in my story, Black Americans in the 19th century United States, at the center of our inquiry into citizenship. There was a kind of revolution, and DJ mentioned the prizes for the book. I don't mention them again, I hope, as an ego matter, but it's to say those prizes are a reflection of how new the ideas were in Birthright Citizens. So I had a chance to pitch to the editors of the 1619 project an expanded version of my ideas in that book. I knew that this might give me an opportunity to see how my own thinking since 2018 had expanded and shifted. And I was able to tell a longer story, for those of you who have read the essay, a story that begins really at the founding and extends all the way past the American Civil War. I was able to tell that broader story that I hadn't been able to fully tell in the book. And that was exciting for me. And there are two questions that have long provoked and challenged and preoccupied legal historians that run underneath this essay. So here, part of my task this afternoon is to kind of clue you all into the rest of the story for this particular essay. The first question that historians had long been occupied with was the significance of an infamous US Supreme Court decision, perhaps the most infamous of US Supreme Court decisions, and that is the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. It is a complex and multifaceted decision, but many generations of historians have been particularly preoccupied with how in 1857, in the Dred Scott decision, Chief Justice Roger Brooke Taney concludes that no Black American, be they enslaved or free, and the free part of the story is going to be important for our conversation and is important for my essay, no Black American could be a citizen of the United States at the founding. And hence, Mr. Scott and his family, who had brought a freedom suit in the state of Missouri, could not bring a case before the US Supreme Court that claimed that they were not, in fact, enslaved. So I wanted to return to that case, and I wanted to do it expressly through the everyday perspectives of Black Americans. How had Black Americans thought about the problem that Justice Taney tries to resolve in Dred Scott? It turns out they had been debating those questions for a very long time. And at the same time, I wanted to challenge the predominant sense that Dred Scott settled the question or was the answer to the question, because in fact, it was not. Dred Scott turns out to be one salvo, an important one, but only one salvo in the long debate over citizenship in early America and how Black Americans are situated before the Constitution. So this is one thing I really wanted folks to take away from this essay. The second is what is for legal historians, again, a long debate about how we tell what precisely is the history of the Constitution. Now, one way of approaching that question, a tried and true way, is to read the text, right? And we do that, and we interpret the text. We try and discern its meaning based on its language, its organization, the context in which it is promulgated, the debates that surround it. So that is a tried and true way of interpreting the Constitution. Legal historians have also, for many generations, been preoccupied with the decisions like Dred Scott that come out of the US Supreme Court, suggesting that somehow the US Supreme Court in practice was the final word on the meaning of the Constitution. Well, I happen to be of a generation and of a school of thought in legal history that suggests otherwise, that suggests that while the Constitution itself, the text, is important, it is only a text, and that the history of the Constitution can only be discovered by examining the debates, the disagreements, the dust-ups around the Constitution's meaning and how that meaning shifts over time. Now we're getting closer to something like history. And finally, my work is informed by a school of thought we sometimes refer to as popular constitutionalism, the recognition that not only does the US Supreme Court interpret the Constitution, but in the everyday life of the nation, many sorts of actors participate in the interpretation, giving meaning to the Constitution. And in my work, importantly, I argued that Black Americans, in many ways, but especially on the question of citizenship in early America, were the principal actors in this popular constitutionalism view, principal actors in breathing meaning into, animating, and otherwise telling us what the Constitution meant. So, where does that take us? It takes us to an important debate in US constitutional law over the meaning of citizenship. It is the debate that is only possible because the Constitution of 1787 does not define who is a citizen of the United States and conversely, who is not a citizen of the United States. It uses the term citizen, it speaks of the rights of citizen. It even provides, for example, that the president must be a natural born citizen of the United States, but nothing in the Constitution tells us who is a citizen and who is not. And furthermore, for Black Americans, from the founding forward, the language is provocative in the Constitution because there is no color line in the original Constitution. And so for some, the door is open to that claim that Black Americans are citizens like any other American before the Constitution. It's a debate because Black Americans recognize how that silence can and will indeed be used against them, that the Constitution will be read as excluding them from its protections, including the terms of citizenship, precisely because of that silence. And so this essay chronicles how Black Americans use their newspapers, their political conventions, the podium, and more to make that argument, even as they are largely excluded from formal proceedings like court deliberations, like constitutional conventions, like the halls of legislatures. Black Americans are building a political culture, including the colored convention movement that I feature here, as a forum, as a platform for engaging in advocacy and sharp interpretation of the Constitution. Why citizenship? Well, partly I tell a story about how this lapse in the Constitution indeed does make it possible for American lawmakers to embed anti-Black racism into the law. Here, we have local laws that are now going to permit Black Americans from, for example, casting ballots on election day. They're going to be disenfranchised. We find inequitable tax schemes. We find what are called Black laws that regulate the everyday lives of formerly enslaved people, how they work, whether or not they can own property, whether they can gather in public assemblies, and much more. So one important answer for Black Americans to these legal degradations is the counter, right? The claim that they are citizens of the United States, guaranteed the protections of the Constitution like all Americans. And this view, they intend to do battle with the kinds of state and local laws that are degrading them. Most important in this story is how Black Americans are using the argument, the claim of citizenship, to counter the agenda and the influence of what in the early 19th century was called the colonization movement. Colonization, I'll explain, but is a political movement that until recently, I think got less than its just attention from historians of racism, particularly anti-Black racism. But here we are, and let me tell you about that movement. Colonization has its origins in the 18th century in founding thinkers like Jefferson, who believe that a few things. Colonizationists believe that ultimately slavery will end in the United States. It might end in a matter of years or decades or even across a century, but they anticipate that slavery will end. And they also are, colonizationists, deeply committed, unshakingly committed to a future in which the United States is a white man's country only. So how do you resolve the tension between, on the one hand, a nation that everyone among the colonizationist movement anticipates, a nation that in which slavery is going to fall away? How do you resolve that? How do you hold that together with the notion that you need to preserve it? The nation is a white man's country. Colonization is the answer. And so colonization societies starting in the 18 teens organized both nationally and at the state level to outfit ships, to organize Black Americans. They found the colony of Liberia in West Africa. And their plan, their scheme, is to literally remove formerly enslaved people, free Black Americans from the country, that to exile them, to banish them, to coerce them, but to rid the nation right, of those Black Americans who now and increasingly across the early 19th century are threatening precisely because they are claiming to be citizens of the United States, to be citizens with all the rights that white Americans enjoy. Colonizationists look to quell that. And in this essay, I tell the story about how Black Americans resist. We see them, for example, in quotidian disputes over taxes, which test the terms of their belonging in a state like Massachusetts. We find them migrating to the West and to new states like Ohio or Missouri, and generating debates in Congress about whether or not Black Americans have a constitutional right to travel between the states. We find them in courthouses like Dred Scott and many others who are using that as a forum for asserting their rights as citizens. And here, Birthright Citizens, the book, and this essay in the 1619 Project collection chronicle that remarkable struggle, which will take us to the Civil War, past Dred Scott, to the Civil War, and beyond, to first the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and then the 14th Amendment ratified in 1868, both of which make unequivocally part of American law this birthright principle that Black Americans have been advocating for a very long time. A couple of more things, and then I'm looking forward to your questions and much more discussion. I do want us to take away a couple of lessons that are not only about the past, but are also about our present in this essay. One of the remarkable things about having originally published some of this work in 2018 is that it clashed sharply with noise out of Washington and out of the White House, administration officials, and ultimately the president, the then president himself, folks who were dead set on doing away with the 14th Amendment, or at least that portion of the 14th Amendment that provided for birthright citizenship. And we can talk more about how this story resonates with the 21st century struggles of immigrant Americans, so-called undocumented Americans in the United States. It turned out that this history had a utility. And so I hope you hear some of those echoes, and that whether as citizens, as immigrant Americans, as advocates, as educators, and more, we use this history to inform those challenges in our own time. I also wanted to push back in this work against a misunderstanding, much of that misunderstanding quite deliberately promoted by the White House in 2018. I wanted to importantly push back against the notion that birthright and the birthright principle as operates in the United States was somehow an overreach or an error or inconsequential, such that it should be corrected or changed. I hope that what this story accomplishes is, in fact, for many Americans, a new understanding of a principle that kind of undergirds many, many of our lives. I am a citizen of the United States by virtue of my birth in the United States. Nothing more, but nothing less. I wanted us to appreciate more fully how the birthright principle was conceived of and set in American law as a profoundly democratic inclusive and radical transformation of how citizenship was understood in the United States. I wanted us to understand that it was a hard fought for and hard won principle that took decades of thought, of activism, and frankly, a civil war in order to secure, so that before we begin to rethink the principle, I thought it was important. I hope it's important, and I hope it's useful, illuminating even, to know where the principle had its origins. A lot of my work has been with this essay and the work that undergirds it with K through 12 educators. So I know well the question, how do we take this work and have it do work in our classrooms? And of course, the answers will vary depending on where you are, what you teach, and a great deal more. But let me just end by offering a few suggestions. The first is finding those places, those natural or pre-existing places in your own lesson plans where the story I tell in this essay intersects or, bumps up against those things you already teach. It might come up when you teach the Constitution itself. It might be for some of you when you touch on the Dred Scott case. This is a chapter that can be taught in the context of the Civil War. For some of you, it might actually come up when you teach lessons in civics and governance. But I think it's important for me to acknowledge that no one, I certainly don't expect anyone to plop this essay into the middle of what they teach, but to borrow pieces from it and to let it help you build out things that you already are teaching. The other thing that has been effective for me, and I think is effective for other educators, is perhaps to find a character in this story and to use that character to help illustrate and draw students into this story, which is very much a story about the history of the Constitution and the history of the law. Now, there are a number of really wonderful characters in this essay, from the Cuffey brothers at the beginning to someone who's among one of my favorites from Baltimore City, a man named George Hackett. These are folks about whom more has been written than I'm able to include in this essay, but they open the door to expanding the biographical turn in history. And I might say permits us to offer up to students at a time when many of the figures that once occupied the pantheon of American memorables, the pantheon of American founders, there are characters in this story who are very much founders, certainly around the question of citizenship in the United States. And so I hope that their stories and their life stories are another way in for educators who are looking to talk about the citizenship question as it is told here in the 1619 Project. I've written an essay that charts out the whole of George Hackett's life. I published it back in August of 2018 for the African American Intellectual History Society. They have a wonderful blog called Black Perspectives. So anybody who'd like to know more about Hackett, I've written a piece there that was very much intended to be a companion to this essay in the 1619 Project by offering up a real character whose life arc is very much parallels the story here And thank you to DJ for posting the link there for everybody. That's terrific. So I think with that, I want to close. And I think someone's going to join me yeah, there's DJ coming back to join me. Thanks so much again, DJ, for doing this with me this afternoon. And let me just say thank you again to the Pulitzer Center, to everyone at the 1619 Project, and all of you for coming out today. It's really been a pleasure and an honor to be with you. So thanks so much.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. And I echo the thanks to the other contributors of the project and everyone involved. Thank you to the 400 attendees we have with us right now. That's just so, so beautiful. There has been a question of sort of connecting with other attendees. We're hoping people do that through social media. We're using the hashtag teaching1619. So sharing quotes from the event, things that are sticking out with you. Maybe you can connect with other teachers that way. And I'll share more about how to connect with our network and the work we're doing at the Pulitzer Center at the end. But I wanted to say where you ended, Professor Jones, the perfect sort of transition for my first question here, which is reading the chapter. Part of what I enjoyed was learning about those characters in history, the Black activists and the leaders, and also the local histories of different cities that I was ignorant of. You know, I may know about where one leader or one activist is from, but it was very cool to read about the history of these conventions in Syracuse and Buffalo and sort of expand my thinking about that. So for a teacher wanting to engage more with that, to teach about the colored conventions, the activists of that time, and to do this work in a sort of local historical context, do you have more resources for them, other places they can start? I know you shared a couple already.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, because the colored conventions are just an extraordinary gold mine for so many kinds of questions you might ask about Black Americans in early America. I used it in an earlier book to talk about how Black Americans, for example, debate women's rights. Well, those debates are happening right there in the colored conventions. And this is a political movement that is born in part, right, as to respond to the colonization movement and to resist colonization, to resist the Black laws. And so it dovetails really importantly with thinking about citizenship. So I'm thrilled to introduce the Colored Conventions Project, directed by Dr. Gabrielle Foreman at Penn State University. That project has made both the minutes of the dozens upon dozens of conventions. And it's wonderful because, you know, if you say, I'm from Michigan, you know, what does this have to do with me? Well, dive into their archive and you will find the minutes of the conventions that were held in the state of Michigan. They go from some of the earliest ones from the 1830s all the way through the 1890s. And so the geography is mind-blowing. It is a real eye-opener about the scale and the scope of Black politics. But this project has made the minutes of the conventions fully available, digitized and searchable, downloadable, and they are also continuing to produce wonderful interpretive essays that help us kind of contextualize what we're seeing in the conferences. So the Colored Convention Project, I see the link is up, thank you. And I can't recommend it enough as an opportunity for students to kind of dive in themselves and see what they discover there. You know, I've discovered citizenship, women's rights, but there's a great deal more, and they're really worth mining. So, so enjoy that, because it's really one of my favorite places to hang around on the web.
Yeah, that's amazing. I will absolutely be checking that out. And it's funny, reading through the essay and reading through the part on colonization was fascinating to me. I'm a Liberian American, and I've been thinking a lot with this project about what it means to sort of have ancestry, right, of folks that decided to leave at that time, and then what it means now for me to be back here and to be a U.S. citizen. And I think a lot of people view the 1619 project as about identity. both individual identity and national identity, which it certainly is. But reading your chapter left me reflecting about the difference between citizenship as a status, like access to different rights, access to a certain place in American society, and that idea of citizenship versus citizenship as an identity, right? And sort of the cultural piece of it. I'm curious if you or other historians that you study and work with make a distinction there, how that distinction might shape conversations. It came up for me for the first time of like, oh, there might be two different threads here, two different ways of thinking about this.
Yeah, at least two different threads. It's a great framing for this. On the one hand, here in early America, the folks I read about are thinking hard about identity. And we see that, for example, when they debate what to call themselves. And so should their political movement be the colored conventions, right? Is that the correct term that sort of captures all of who they are? Or should some of the conventions will be called, the Convention for the Free People of Color. Their churches will be called the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the African and Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. So there's a live debate, and you can find those debates in the minutes of the conventions. Because they are wrestling, right, with precisely the question that you pose, which is not only who we are before the law, right, but who are we? And this is the moment, right, in which that distinct identity that will have many names and will have growing facets, but that distinct Black identity is being forged in political culture and coalescing as an identity. So I think those two things are companion stories. In fact, probably they are sort of interwoven stories. But I do want to say that I think it is important for me to dwell on the significance of status. And if we doubt that, we need only, read the chronicles of our own time to appreciate, right, how vulnerable, how fragile folks are when their status as citizens, as lawful residents, as permanent, when status is in question. We have just lived through a harrowing administration that proposed to divide us precisely along the lines of status. And what we had forgotten, if I could say, for a long time, was that before the Civil War, before the 14th Amendment, that was where Black Americans were in this country, subject to arbitrary banishment, removal, exile, and more. And that there is nothing sort of ministerial about being a citizen of the United States when you are among the despised, right? Because it is citizenship that insulates you from the very real possibility that you might be against your will and without process, wholesale removed from the United States. And many Black Americans who leave for Liberia in those years are among those who say, the US is never going to honor me as a citizen of the United States. And Liberia at least promises me that, right? It promises me an indelible belonging as a citizen. And so that is part of the story of Liberia's origins, or one facet of it, right, is in this functional expulsion, right, from US citizenship for too many Black Americans. I'm so glad you shared that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been really an interest. I could go on a tangent about it, but it's working with this project has really helped me continue some of the reflection I was already doing about that portion of my identity. And I don't know if folks saw me. I pulled up the book as you were talking because it reminded me of a specific quote I had underlined here. John Floyd of Virginia is saying, could not the states now seize these persons and make them slaves again, right? Speaking on freed Black Americans or freed Black people at the time, and how absurd it was to consider that they might be owed citizenship status and what comes with that. And I'm curious, and I'll ask a couple more questions I had prepared and then go to these amazing questions that are coming in through the Q&A from folks in our audience. Thank you for your patience there. But I love that this chapter frames again for us the fight that went into both the establishing of birthright citizenship and even some of the rights that came after, voting rights and these things. Do you think that we're at a point now, you mentioned some of the legislation and things of our time, where birthright citizenship, as we've defined it since 1868, is at risk? And what are the implications of that? How can folks be a part of making sure that that doesn't happen?
Yeah, perhaps is the answer, right? Because I'm like most folks, and I really don't have a crystal ball. It can tell me precisely where we're headed, unfortunately. But I will say that, frankly, the dust up over birthright citizenship that erupted in 2018 was not something that most commentators, pundits had anticipated. How far the administration could, in fact, take that and raise an interesting question that I think is still an open question, which is not simply what does the 14th Amendment say? What is birthright citizenship? Who's in, who's out, right? That's part of the debate. But there's another question, which is who gets to decide? And that's part of what was going on in the Trump years was, is this a question for Congress, right? Can Congress legislate what birthright means and who it's applicable to? Well, it's already true that Congress does some of that. Do they have exclusive authority, or can the president use an executive order and challenge or transform the meaning of birthright? Or is it only the Supreme Court that can ultimately interpret the 14th Amendment and tell us what it means, importantly, vis-a-vis immigrant Americans, undocumented Americans? And I think while we now are subject to a White House regime that is not interested in pressing those questions, it doesn't mean that they've disappeared. It means that they have lulled. And so I hope, right, that part of what we still want to know, right, is what are the origins and where do we come down on the significance and the meaning and the value of birthright, even in the 21st century. And finally, because your question was sort of what do we do? You know, one of the surprises out of this work for me is how much time I've had the privilege of spending with immigrant communities and with immigrant advocates in this country, because sometimes this is a history that emboldens, right? Because it's really a story about a community of Americans that for a very long time were knocking on the door, pounding on the door of citizenship. And it was a long struggle, but ultimately I think this is a reminder that if you are of a community that is struggling for belonging, right, and looking to repel the threat of exclusion or removal or banishment, that is a very American struggle. And Black Americans waged that struggle. That there's nothing illegitimate, there's nothing out of step, there's nothing un-American about that. That is as American as we get when it comes to citizenship. And this story should, I think, authorize that struggle over new ideas about who is a citizen of the United States and by what terms that suit the 21st century, just as Black Americans transform citizenship in their own vision in the 19th century.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. I'm looking through some of the questions we have here now from the audience. I think this one is connected to some of what I think is already in the essay, but Ruth asks, or says that they're seeking references on activism, joy, rebellion, and agency of Black Americans that might connect with youth specifically, or no, this one isn't specific to, but with youth. And they're looking for a sense of what we can share that varies activist protest and rebellion in those movements. Do you have any resources that might be of reference for that, for what, I guess, just what a variety of types of rebellion and activism and where joy could be found in that historically?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I guess I have two thoughts. In addition to the colored conventions, which I've already mentioned, which I think are very much that, right? You know, read the conventions, you know, in 1865, 66, 67, 68, and watch, right, how activists who have been struggling for a very long time under very difficult circumstances now are going to step into, right, the possibilities that are constructed by the war. Among the activists in those latter conventions is a woman named Mary Ann Shadd Cary. Mary Ann Shadd Cary is an educator, a refugee to Canada during the pre-Civil War decade. She settles in Canada West, today's Ontario, and she founds a newspaper. And so she's an example of someone whose newspaper we can go back to. And yes, we can discover how she thinks about citizenship, how she thinks about voting rights, how she thinks about women's rights. But she really is a chronicler of Black America in all its forms. And so she's there, for example, to celebrate and to hold up Black women activists who are trying to break into the political sphere. She is there to hold up the everyday rituals of her refugee community in Canada West. So we go back to the Black newspapers. We go back to the published work of many of these figures as a way of capturing some of that. Well, I'll say I published a book in 2020 called Vanguard, which is a history of Black women in voting rights. And part of what runs through Vanguard and the archives in Vanguard, right, are the ways in which Black women are like doing the work, but also the ways in which they are very much in community and lifting each other up across generations in ways that are sometimes quite serious, in other ways, I think also quite joyful. So I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but it's just a little insight. And I will say that while I don't expect my students to always read the footnotes, I recommend that educators do, because in the footnotes is where we leave the crumbs and we show you the way to the primary materials that permit you to ask the kinds of questions that you want to have answered for yourselves and for your students. And so you know, read the footnotes and follow the breadcrumbs and make your own history, right, out of the kinds of sources that we use in this work. I think it's really important.
Yeah, and we're getting close on time. This is a big question. I think maybe not. You're the historian, but a question that just came in was just around if you can point to some of the sources around that uphold the theory that slavery would go away over time, or that the institution of slavery would look different in the U.S. Someone is wanting to look more into like what theories were inspiring those thinkers that you referenced.
Sure. So, I mean, one place to start might be in my work on the colonization movement. but the papers of the American Colonization Society are vast and maybe a little too dense for even me, but they are held at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, which is just a few blocks from me here. And there are now really good histories of the colonization movement that any librarian should be able to help you find. That might take you back to the writings of someone like Jefferson, and notes on the state of Virginia, if you were looking to go back to, some of the earliest sources. But colonizationists are prolific. They produce a newspaper called the African Repository, which is fully digitized on Google. You can use their newspapers, but there is a really formidable paper trail. They really believe that they are worthy of historical study. Make of that what you will. But it means that they live a pretty formidable paper trail of the institutional papers of the organization, the personal papers of many of the principals, their newspapers, and then the colored conventions, which is where you find sort of the commentary and the critique really importantly leveled. So thrilled to have folks take a deeper dive into the colonization movement.
Thank you. We have a question from Clarice about whether or not there are thoughts of making a book for younger readers. So Clarice, there is a picture book for the project now, Born on the Water. It's gorgeous, but I think your question might be around whether there's a plan to make it a sort of anthology like for other readers, which I don't know if you can speak to, Professor Jones. I will. I
don't know the answer to that.
Yeah,
but I hear the interest and maybe the necessity for it. So I'll hope somebody else from the backside of the project is able to answer that. But I also endorse this young person's book, when I think you're having some of the folks who were that as guests at some tomorrow, maybe. I don't know, you'll say when, but I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Our keynote for tomorrow is with Renee Watson, who is the co-author of Born on the Water, and Nicholas Smith, who did the gorgeous illustrations. And Clarice and anyone else wondering, I will say another good place to kind of look at how teachers have taken the essays of the project and scaffolded them, sort of chunked the text for student access, would be in our curricular resources portal. The lessons that our network teams have produced, they're going up each week, and a lot of them will have sort of the essay in full from the original text, and then how the teacher, broke that down for their students to use. So hopefully that's a helpful tool as well.
Thank you, Pulitzer Center.
Great. And let me see, I think we maybe have time for one more. We have a teacher from a state where they're increasing restrictions on sort of what teachers can do, particularly around teaching anti-racism or anything that might be construed as critical race theory. And they're just wondering if you have any comments for teachers in that situation, or yeah.
Well, I mean, thank you for letting that be sort of where we wrap up today. I don't have, it won't surprise you, a solution or an answer to where we are. But I want to say to all the educators with us and those beyond that I recognize that you all are on the front lines of a struggle that I think is going to be with us for some time. My work, along with the work of this project, has been banned in many states now. But it is not banned in my classrooms, right? And so I still, and I appreciate the distance between my experience of this moment and the experience of being an educator subject to surveillance and scrutiny and more. And I am of the view that this debate, this phase of the debate, the history wars, the culture wars that we're in, will transform. I'm not sure how, but where we're headed is to 2026 and the US at 250. And I think that gives us an opportunity, a platform, a framing, and an urgency that we need in order not only to weather this moment, but to organize ourselves to see it through. The idea that we would mark the US at 250 and do that through a framework of, suppression and control and surveillance and the banning of materials is something that I think many more folks will arrive to challenge as we approach 250. It's almost antithetical, isn't it, to mark 250 and to do it under those terms. So none of that is an answer or a solution. I can say for my own small part, being here today is one part of what I've committed myself to this year, which is to being with as many of you and bringing this work to as many of you so that we have it, in our satchels and in our arsenals. And we will continue, I think, in this extraordinarily critical struggle over knowledge, learning, and history. So I appreciate the question, and I appreciate the chance to be in solidarity with you all as we weather these months and struggle through them. But I do think more folks are going to come to the table as we approach the US at 250. And if you're not like me and planning to be retired by then, it's really on the horizon. And so many of us are sort of preparing already for that possibility.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this opening keynote. It has been fantastic. Thank you again, Professor Jones. You can read Professor Jones's full essay on citizenship in the 1619 Project, A New Origin Story. We shared the link for 1619books.com earlier. The next conference event is a panel on teaching 1619 at all age levels, and that starts at 2:15 Eastern Time. So we hope to see you there. Until then, please, you're encouraged to share your takeaways from this panel using the hashtag teaching 1619. I will be on there looking for your responses. And we love to connect with you and other attendees and participants. We also encourage you to consider applying for the next cohort of our network. Applications will launch this week on our website and in our education newsletter. So if you go to 1619education.org, you'll see where you can sign up for our newsletter and where to receive more information about when those applications for the next cohort open. Thank you so much.